Hey friends, I'm so glad you're here. Grab a cozy seat and settle in. We've got a wonderful journey ahead. And if you enjoy spending this time together, I'd love for you to subscribe. Tap that little thumbs up and share your thoughts down below. It really means a lot. Sargon and the First Empire, Mesopotamia's royal beginning. Chapter 1. The origins of Sumerian city-states. The fertile lands of Mesopotamia, between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Some of the first city-states in human history began to emerge around 3000 before Common Era. These early cities were unlike anything the world had seen before. Places of organized life, advanced infrastructure, and complex societies. The people of this land, the Sumerians, were the first to lay the foundations of what we recognize today as civilization. The Sumerians built their cities on the banks of the rivers, which provided not only water, but also fertile soil for agriculture. This agricultural abundance allowed them to support large populations, which in turn led to the growth of cities. These cities, such as Uruk, Ur, and Lagash, became centers of culture, religion, and governance. What set Sumer apart from earlier human settlements was its urbanization. Unlike the scattered villages that existed before, Sumerian city-states were meticulously planned. Each city had its own walls for protection, and within those walls, there were markets, temples, and administrative buildings. These cities were the heartbeat of the Sumerian civilization, each one a small kingdom in its own right. The Sumerians were not just farmers. They were also brilliant engineers, builders, and traders. They constructed impressive ziggurats, stepped temples dedicated to their gods, reaching into the skies, symbolizing the connection between the heavens and the earth. These ziggurats were focal points of religious life, but also symbols of the power and prosperity of the cities. Each city-state had a patron god, and it was believed that the rulers of these cities were chosen by these gods to rule on their behalf. The most important and revered god in Sumer was Anu, the sky god. But there were many others, each associated with different aspects of life and nature. Though these early city-states were politically independent, they shared common cultural traits, from their language to their religious practices. Over time, these city-states began to compete with each other for resources, power, and territory, setting the stage for the emergence of the first monarchies. The origins of these city-states are not fully understood, but it is clear that they represent a monumental shift in human history. The Sumerians had created a complex society with all the hallmarks of civilization: writing, trade, law, and art. The foundation had been laid for the emergence of powerful kings and empires. Chapter 2. The first rulers and dynasties. As the Sumerian city-states flourished, the need for organization and leadership became increasingly apparent. Early on, leadership likely began with tribal chiefs or elders who guided the community through daily decisions. However, as the city-states grew in complexity and size, these leaders evolved into more formalized rulers, marking the beginning of dynasties. The first rulers of Sumer were not kings in the way we think of them today, but were more often military or religious leaders who took on important responsibilities, both protecting their people and overseeing the functioning of the city-state. Over time, these leaders began to claim a divine right to rule, establishing the belief that they were chosen by the gods to lead and protect their people. One of the earliest examples of such rulers is the legendary Gilgamesh of Uruk. Though his historicity is debated, the Epic of Gilgamesh, which was written down in Akkadian, remains one of the most important texts from ancient Mesopotamia. Gilgamesh was depicted as a two-thirds divine, one-third human king, whose strength and ambition were unmatched. His reign is considered a reflection of the growing idea that rulers were not only secular leaders, but also representatives of the divine on earth. As the Sumerians developed more complex societies, their rulers began to form dynasties. These dynasties were typically established through inheritance, often from father to son, but they were not guaranteed to last. Dynastic succession was often interrupted by violence, with rival factions competing for power. In fact, it was not uncommon for a new ruler to come to power by defeating the previous ruler in battle, as political alliances were as fragile as the shifting sands of the region. Despite the instability that often accompanied dynastic rule, these early monarchs began to cement the foundations of governance. They were tasked with not only military defense but also the administration of laws, the management of the economy, and the establishment of trade networks. Their cities grew in both size and sophistication, and so did the idea of kingship itself. With their elevated status came the construction of monumental buildings, palaces, temples, and ziggurats, which showcased their power and divine favor. Dynastic rule was closely tied to religion. Each city-state had its own patron deity, and the king was expected to act as a bridge between the gods and the people. The ruler's role was to maintain favor with these gods through offerings, prayers, and, when necessary, warfare. This connection between kingship and religion helped solidify the king's power, as it was believed that his actions directly influenced the prosperity or failure of the city-state. The growing need for centralized leadership also led to the development of early bureaucracies. Rulers relied on scribes and administrators to handle matters of governance, such as tax collection, trade regulation, and the enforcement of laws. These bureaucratic structures, though simple by modern standards, were essential in maintaining the flow of goods, services, and information in increasingly complex societies. Thus, the rise of dynasties marked a pivotal moment in Mesopotamian history. Kings and their descendants would come to rule for generations, each contributing to the rich tapestry of Sumerian civilization, whether through military conquest, religious dedication, or economic growth. Yet, with each new dynasty came the uncertainty of succession, always leaving room for new contenders to vie for power. Chapter 3. Gods and Kings. A divine connection in the world of ancient Sumer. The line between the divine and the mortal was incredibly thin. The Sumerians believed that the gods not only created the world, but were intimately involved in the lives of its inhabitants, especially the rulers. For the kings of Sumer, their power was not just a result of their political savvy or military prowess, it was deeply rooted in their connection to the gods. Each Sumerian city-state had its own patron deity, a god or goddess who was considered the protector and ruler of that city. These gods were believed to hold ultimate power over nature, life, and death. As such, the rulers of these cities were not simply seen as secular leaders. They were viewed as chosen representatives of the gods on earth, tasked with maintaining divine order and protecting their people. One of the most significant ways in which kings connected with the gods was through the practice of temple worship. Temples were not just places of prayer and sacrifice. They were the centers of political and economic life. The ruler, often regarded as the high priest, would oversee rituals meant to honor the gods and ensure their favor. These rituals were not only religious but political, as the king's relationship with the gods was considered a direct reflection of the city-state's prosperity. If the king was seen as favored by the gods, the people would experience good harvests, successful trade, and peace. If the king failed to uphold divine favor, the consequences could be disastrous. The Sumerians believed that the gods had created kings to keep order in the world and maintain justice, especially in times of war or unrest. The king's role as the intermediary between the gods and the people was thus vital. It was believed that the gods not only gave the king his power, but also protected the city from enemies. However, kings also had to perform certain duties to retain their divine favor. Military victories were seen as a direct sign of divine approval, while defeats were interpreted as a loss of favor. In fact, the relationship between kings and gods often played a central role in the justification of military conquests. A king might claim that the gods had instructed him to expand his kingdom, conquer neighboring territories, and assert his power. This divine mandate was not just political rhetoric. It was a fundamental belief that shaped the very identity of the king and his rule. For example, Sargon the Great, one of the most famous early monarchs, was said to have been chosen by the god Enlil to establish the Akkadian Empire, which he claimed was destined by the gods to unite the Sumerian and Akkadian people. The divine connection between gods and kings was also reflected in the king's public image. Royal inscriptions often depicted the king in divine poses, sometimes even shown as being touched by the gods. Kings were frequently represented as warriors favored by the gods, sometimes even shown in close association with the gods themselves. The Sumerian king's image was one of divine power, commanding respect and reverence from his subjects. The power of the gods, however, was not always easy to control. If a king made mistakes or failed to uphold divine favor, the consequences were severe. In some cases, this could lead to rebellion, the overthrow of the king, or even the eventual decline of the city-state. But when the king was successful in maintaining his divine connection, the city-state could flourish, with the ruler basking in the glow of divine approval. As Sumerian civilization progressed, the kingship itself became an enduring institution, with the king continuing to be seen as the divine representative of the gods. This belief in the divine right of kings spread to neighboring cultures, and it became a central tenet of monarchies in the ancient world. The connection between gods and kings would continue to shape the structure of societies, reinforcing the notion that rulers were both political leaders and spiritual guides for their people. Chapter 4. The City of Uruk and its power. Uruk, often regarded as one of the greatest cities of early Mesopotamian civilization, stood as a symbol of both political and cultural power. Located in the southern part of modern-day Iraq, Uruk was one of the first true urban centers in human history. Its towering walls and monumental buildings testified to its wealth, sophistication, and influence. In many ways, Uruk can be seen as the heart of Sumerian culture, setting the stage for future cities and empires. Founded around 4000 before Common Era, Uruk was one of the first cities to reach a remarkable level of urbanization. The city's rapid growth and development can be attributed to its prime location along the Euphrates River, which facilitated trade, agriculture, and communication. As a result, Uruk became a major center for commerce, craft production, and administration. It was home to tens of thousands of people, and over time, its influence spread far beyond the city's walls. At the heart of Uruk was its magnificent ziggurat, a towering structure that represented the city's religious and political power. Dedicated to the goddess Inanna, the ziggurat was both a temple and a symbol of the king's connection to the divine. The structure's impressive height and ornate design made it one of the most important architectural achievements of early Mesopotamian society. It was not only a place of worship, but also a center for political gatherings and administrative work. The ziggurat and its associated temple complex served as a focal point for both the king and the people, reinforcing the close relationship between religion and governance in early Sumer. The city's rulers were not just political leaders, they were also religious figures, acting as high priests of Inanna. This dual role gave them immense authority, as they were seen as the earthly representatives of the goddess. This connection to the divine strengthened the king's power, as it was believed that the gods themselves were watching over and guiding the city's fate. Uruk's kingship was therefore a combination of both spiritual and secular power, a delicate balance that ensured the stability of the city. Uruk's economy was also one of the driving forces behind its power. The city's farmers and artisans produced goods for both local consumption and trade. Agricultural products, such as barley and wheat, were in high demand, as were crafted goods like textiles and pottery. This trade not only supported the city's growing population but also expanded its influence. Uruk became a hub for the exchange of goods, ideas, and technology, linking it with other Sumerian cities and regions beyond. Perhaps one of Uruk's most lasting contributions to civilization was its development of writing. The city is often credited with the creation of cuneiform, one of the earliest systems of writing, which was initially used for record-keeping and administrative purposes. Cuneiform symbols, etched into clay tablets, allowed the rulers of Uruk to maintain detailed records of trade, tax collection, and the distribution of goods. This innovation paved the way for the future development of written language and bureaucracy, which would become essential for the functioning of the larger Sumerian state. Uruk's military power also played a crucial role in its rise to prominence. The city's strategic location, combined with its well-organized military forces, allowed it to defend its interests and expand its territory. The kings of Uruk often led military campaigns against neighboring city-states, using their growing influence to maintain control over trade routes and resources. This expansionist attitude, however, also led to conflict with other rising powers in the region, as Uruk's neighbors sought to challenge its dominance. Despite its initial prosperity, Uruk's influence eventually waned, particularly as other powerful city-states, like Ur and Akkad, rose to prominence. However, the legacy of Uruk endured, influencing the development of later Mesopotamian cities and serving as a model for urban planning, governance, and religious practices. Uruk was not just a city, it was a cornerstone of early civilization, a place where the foundations of writing, trade, and political organization were laid. Chapter 5. Economy and Trade. In early Mesopotamia, the economy of early Mesopotamia was a complex system that intertwined agriculture, trade, and craftsmanship, laying the foundation for the development of civilization as we know it. The Sumerians, residing between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, were keenly aware of their environment and developed methods to harness the natural resources around them. Their innovative solutions to agricultural and economic challenges enabled their society to thrive and grow. At the heart of the Sumerian economy was agriculture. The fertile lands between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers provided the perfect environment for crop cultivation. Through a system of irrigation, the Sumerians were able to control the flow of river water to their fields, allowing them to grow crops year-round. Barley was the most important crop, used both as a food source and as a form of currency. Wheat, dates, and flax were also common agricultural products, and the success of these crops supported a population that numbered in the tens of thousands. In addition to farming, the Sumerians were skilled craftsmen. They produced a wide range of goods, from textiles and pottery to metalwork and jewelry. These goods were traded both within Mesopotamia and with neighboring regions, providing the Sumerians with access to materials they could not produce themselves, such as wood, stone, and metals like copper and tin. This trade was essential to the growth of the Sumerian city-states, as it allowed them to acquire the raw materials needed for construction, weaponry, and everyday tools. Trade in Mesopotamia was conducted both by land and by river. The rivers served as natural highways, allowing goods to be transported over long distances with relative ease. The Euphrates, in particular, was a vital route for trade between the cities of Sumer and other regions, including the Indus Valley to the east, Anatolia to the north, and Egypt to the west. Through this trade network, Mesopotamia became a melting pot of ideas, technology, and culture, further enriching the Sumerian civilization. Markets in Sumerian cities, such as Uruk and Ur, were bustling centers of commerce, where merchants and traders gathered to buy and sell goods. These markets were often overseen by the king or his officials, ensuring that trade ran smoothly and that the state could collect taxes on transactions. The establishment of a tax system was crucial for the functioning of the Sumerian economy, as it helped fund the city's defense, religious rituals, and the king's bureaucracy. One of the key innovations of Sumerian commerce was the development of writing, cuneiform. The world's earliest known writing system was initially created for economic purposes, such as record-keeping and trade documentation. Merchants used clay tablets to record transactions, list goods, and track debts. These written records helped streamline trade and ensure the proper distribution of goods, making the economy more efficient and organized. Cuneiform also allowed for the creation of contracts, making it possible for individuals to enter into agreements that were legally binding. The Sumerians also developed a system of weights and measures to standardize trade. This system allowed merchants to exchange goods with confidence, knowing that the amounts were accurate and fair. In addition, the use of silver as a form of currency further facilitated trade, providing a standardized medium of exchange that could be used across the region. While trade and agriculture formed the backbone of the Sumerian economy, it was also supported by the labor of the people. Skilled workers, such as metal workers, weavers, and potters, produced the goods that were traded both locally and abroad. The division of labor was highly specialized, with individuals dedicating themselves to specific crafts, which allowed for the production of high-quality goods. This specialization contributed to the wealth of the Sumerian city-states and reinforced their dominance in the ancient world. However, the economy was not without its challenges. The Sumerians were often vulnerable to natural disasters such as floods or droughts, which could disrupt agricultural production and trade. In times of crisis, the king would often intervene to provide relief, organizing the distribution of food and supplies to the people. The Sumerians also faced external threats, such as invasions by neighboring tribes and city-states, which could destabilize their economy and trade routes. Despite these challenges, the economy of early Mesopotamia was remarkably resilient. The Sumerians' ability to adapt to their environment, develop trade networks, and innovate in commerce allowed them to build one of the most advanced and prosperous societies of the ancient world. Their economic achievements set the stage for the rise of later civilizations, and the systems they developed would influence the economies of future empires. Chapter 6: The Role of Temples in Politics and Ancient Mesopotamian Society. Temples were not just religious centers, but powerful political institutions that played a pivotal role in governance. The relationship between the temples and the kingship was intricate, as both religious and secular powers were often intertwined. The rulers of the early Sumerian city-states understood that the favor of the gods was essential for maintaining their rule, and the temples served as the primary institutions through which the kings communicated with the divine. Temples were monumental structures, often towering over the surrounding city with their impressive ziggurats, which were massive stepped pyramids built to honor the gods. These temples were not only places of worship, they were also centers of administration, economics, and even military command. The priests who ran these temples had significant influence over both religious and secular matters. In many ways, they acted as the political elite, guiding the rulers in matters of statecraft and ensuring that the will of the gods was carried out. One of the key roles of the temple was to manage the city's resources. The temples controlled vast tracts of land and employed a large workforce of farmers, artisans, and laborers. They collected agricultural surpluses and distributed them to the population. The temple was a central point in the economy, functioning as both a producer and distributor of goods. The king, in his role as the high priest or chief patron of the temple, would oversee the distribution of these resources, ensuring that the people had enough to live on, and that the temple received the offerings it was due. The king's connection to the temple and its priests was crucial for his legitimacy. As a representative of the gods on earth, the king's authority was often seen as divinely sanctioned. The priests, in turn, acted as the king's advisors, guiding him in matters of war, diplomacy, and governance. In some cases, the priesthood held as much power as the king, if not more. This balance of power between kings and priests created a delicate relationship, one where the king had to maintain the favor of the gods, often through temple rituals, offerings, and sacrifices. In addition to managing resources, temples were also responsible for upholding justice and law. They were often the centers for the establishment and enforcement of legal codes. The most famous of these codes is the Code of Ur-Nammu, one of the earliest known legal systems, which was created by the king of Ur around 2100 before Common Era. The code, written on clay tablets, covered a wide range of topics, from property rights to family law, and was enforced by the temple's administration. The king, as the protector of justice, was responsible for ensuring that the laws were upheld, with the temple acting as the enforcer. Furthermore, the temples served as hubs for education and knowledge. Scribes, who were trained in the temple schools, learned how to read and write in cuneiform, the Sumerian writing system. These scribes played an essential role in the functioning of the state, recording everything from trade transactions to royal decrees. They were the record keepers of the kingdom, ensuring that the king's actions, as well as the temple's, were carefully documented for posterity. Religious ceremonies also had political implications. Kings often performed grand rituals in the temple to demonstrate their devotion to the gods and their commitment to maintaining order in the kingdom. These ceremonies were public affairs designed to reinforce the king's divine status in the eyes of the people. Kings were sometimes depicted in temple artwork as standing before the gods, receiving blessings or making offerings, symbolizing their role as intermediaries between the divine and the mortal world. In times of crisis, such as droughts, floods, or military defeat, kings would turn to the temple for guidance, offering sacrifices and performing rituals to appease the gods and restore balance. The influence of the temple extended beyond the city-state level. As city-states like Ur, Uruk, and Lagash grew in size and power, their temples became more prominent, with their priests and kings expanding their influence into surrounding territories. In this way, the temple played an important role in the creation of early empires. The rise of larger and more powerful states led to the consolidation of temple power and the strengthening of the king's divine mandate. As Mesopotamian civilization advanced, the role of the temple in politics remained central. Even as kingdoms and empires evolved, the close relationship between the ruler and the temple continued to be a defining feature of Mesopotamian politics. The belief that kings were divinely chosen to rule, with the temple as the center of both religious and political power, was an enduring aspect of Mesopotamian governance. Chapter 7. The Rise of the Akkadian Empire. The Akkadian Empire stands as one of the earliest examples of a centralized, multi-ethnic empire in world history. Founded by Sargon the Great around 2334 before Common Era, The Akkadian Empire would stretch across much of Mesopotamia, uniting the Sumerian city-states under one ruler for the first time. This empire not only marked a significant shift in the political landscape of Mesopotamia, but also laid the groundwork for future empires in the region and beyond. Sargon, born in the city of Akkad, which would later give the empire its name, rose to power under rather unusual circumstances. His origins are shrouded in mystery and legend, with various stories describing him as a humble servant or even the son of a priestess, abandoned by his mother as a child. Despite these humble beginnings, Sargon's military skills and political acumen enabled him to rise through the ranks, eventually overthrowing the ruler of Kish and establishing himself as the king of the Akkadian city-state. What set Sargon apart from previous rulers was his vision for unification. Rather than simply ruling over a single city-state, Sargon sought to bring all of Mesopotamia under one banner. His ability to build alliances and conquer rival cities played a critical role in the rapid expansion of his empire. By the time of his death, Sargon had established control over the entirety of Sumer, as well as parts of Syria and Elam, far beyond the boundaries of any previous Mesopotamian kingdom. One of the key factors in the rise of the Akkadian Empire was the ability of Sargon and his successors to harness the military and logistical capabilities of the region. The Akkadians were skilled warriors, and Sargon's military campaigns were often marked by the use of highly organized, disciplined forces that could rapidly mobilize to crush rebellions or conquer neighboring territories. The success of the Akkadian army lay not only in its strength, but in its ability to coordinate and execute military campaigns with precision. Sargon's rise to power also relied heavily on his political genius. He understood that maintaining control over such a vast territory required more than just military force. It required a cohesive system of governance. To this end, Sargon established a centralized administration, appointing governors to oversee different regions of the empire. These governors were responsible for maintaining order, collecting taxes, and enforcing the laws. This system of regional administration helped Sargon keep control over his diverse empire, ensuring that each part of the Akkadian world operated in relative harmony. Sargon's empire was also marked by the spread of Akkadian language and culture. As the empire expanded, the Akkadian language became the lingua franca of Mesopotamia, replacing Sumerian as the dominant language of administration and trade. This linguistic shift played a key role in the unification of the empire, as it provided a common means of communication across the diverse regions Sargon ruled. The Akkadian language, written in cuneiform, was used for official inscriptions, legal documents, and trade records, further solidifying its role in governance. Alongside the spread of language, Sargon promoted the idea of a unified Mesopotamian culture. He encouraged the worship of Akkadian gods and established temples in conquered territories to strengthen his divine connection and legitimacy. In this way, the Akkadian Empire was not just a political entity, but also a cultural and religious one, with Sargon positioning himself as the divine ruler chosen by the gods to unify Mesopotamia. However, the Akkadian Empire was not without its challenges. The vast territory that Sargon had conquered was difficult to govern, and over time, internal rebellions and external pressures began to erode the stability of the empire. Sargon's successors, particularly his grandson Naram-Sin, faced difficulties in maintaining control over the empire, as local rulers and city-states sought to regain their independence. Despite these challenges, the Akkadian Empire remained a powerful force in Mesopotamian politics for several centuries. The Akkadian Empire's legacy, however, extends far beyond its political and military achievements. The empire helped lay the foundations for future empires in the region, particularly the Babylonian and Assyrian empires, which would emerge centuries later. The idea of centralized rule, the use of a common language, and the integration of diverse cultures into a unified political system would influence the course of Mesopotamian history for generations. In many ways, the Akkadian Empire represents the first true empire in history, one that sought to unite a vast and diverse region under a single ruler. Though it would eventually decline due to internal strife and external invasions, its influence can still be felt in the subsequent rise of powerful kingdoms and empires across the ancient world. Chapter 8. Sargon the Great. The first true monarch, Sargon the Great, is one of the most iconic figures in ancient history, often considered the first true monarch to build a lasting empire. His rise from humble beginnings to ruler of the Akkadian Empire represents a remarkable chapter in Mesopotamian history, setting the stage for future empires across the ancient world. But it wasn't just his military conquests or political genius that earned him this title. It was his ability to consolidate power, unify diverse peoples, and establish a legacy that would influence generations. Sargon's early life is steeped in mystery, with conflicting accounts of his origins. According to legend, he was the son of a priestess who placed him in a basket and abandoned him on the river. The story mirrors that of other great historical figures, suggesting a divinely ordained rise to greatness. Regardless of the truth behind his birth, what is clear is that Sargon's ambition, intellect, and military prowess drove him to seize power in a region already full of powerful city-states. Before Sargon, Mesopotamia was divided into multiple city-states, each with its own ruler. These city-states, such as Uruk, Ur, and Lagash, operated independently, often in competition with one another. Sargon's genius lay in his ability to see beyond the petty rivalries of the Sumerian city-states and imagine a unified Mesopotamia, one where different peoples and cultures could coexist under a single rule. To achieve this, Sargon employed both military force and strategic diplomacy, relying on alliances, conquests, and marriages to consolidate his power. The first major step in Sargon's rise was his conquest of the city-state of Kish, which was a powerful regional rival. After defeating Kish, Sargon went on to conquer the rest of Sumer, including the cities of Uruk and Ur. But unlike previous conquerors who might have ruled only through force, Sargon sought to integrate his new territories. He appointed loyal governors and established a centralized administration that helped maintain control over the newly unified regions. This system of governance was revolutionary in its scope, laying the foundation for future imperial structures in Mesopotamia. Sargon's military campaigns were instrumental in expanding his empire. His forces, well-trained and highly disciplined, moved quickly and efficiently across the region, using chariots, infantry, and siege tactics to defeat the city-states that opposed him. Sargon's armies were not just an instrument of war. They were also symbols of his power and divine right to rule. His victories were seen as a confirmation of his favor with the gods, and he made sure to capitalize on this image by commissioning inscriptions that depicted him as the chosen ruler of the gods. While Sargon was known for his military successes, he was also an astute statesman who understood the importance of culture and religion in legitimizing his rule. One of his most significant contributions was the spread of Akkadian culture and language. Akkadian, which had been spoken in the city of Akkad, became the lingua franca of the empire, replacing Sumerian as the primary language of administration and trade. This linguistic shift helped to unify the empire's diverse populations and facilitated communication across vast distances. Sargon also recognized the importance of religion in maintaining control over his empire. He elevated the Akkadian god Marduk as the central deity of his empire, positioning himself as the divine representative of Marduk on earth. By aligning himself with the gods, Sargon reinforced his status as a god-chosen ruler and ensured that his reign would be viewed as legitimate in the eyes of the people. His devotion to Marduk, along with his military and administrative abilities, created a sense of stability and continuity in the empire. In addition to his religious and cultural influence, Sargon was a pioneer in the development of imperial administration. He established a network of governors and officials who were responsible for overseeing different regions of the empire. These administrators were tasked with collecting taxes, maintaining law and order, and overseeing local governance. Sargon's system of centralized control allowed him to maintain authority over a vast and diverse empire, even though it spanned different cultures and languages. Sargon's reign also saw the flourishing of trade and commerce. With his military conquests, he secured vital trade routes that connected Mesopotamia with regions far beyond, including the Indus Valley and Anatolia. Goods such as textiles, metals, and grain flowed through Akkad, contributing to the prosperity of the empire. Sargon also established a standardized system of weights and measures, which helped facilitate trade and ensure fairness in the marketplace. Despite his many successes, Sargon's reign was not without its challenges. Maintaining control over such a large and diverse empire proved to be difficult, and after his death, the Akkadian Empire began to experience internal strife and external pressure. The empire's size made it vulnerable to rebellion and invasion, and Sargon's successors struggled to maintain the cohesion that he had established. However, the legacy of Sargon the Great lived on long after his death. His vision of a unified Mesopotamia paved the way for future empires in the region, and his methods of governance, military strategy, and cultural integration influenced subsequent rulers. Sargon's name became synonymous with empire building, and his accomplishments set the standard for future monarchs who sought to unite disparate peoples under a single rule. Chapter 9. Sargon's Ascension. From messenger to King, Sargon's rise to the throne is as remarkable as it is legendary. His journey from a humble servant to the founder of the Akkadian Empire is one of the most captivating stories in ancient history. While the details of his early life remain somewhat murky, the tale of his ascension to power illustrates the immense ambition, cunning, and determination that would define his reign. Sargon's story begins not as a ruler, but as a servant working for the king of Kish, one of the most powerful city-states of the time. According to the ancient legends, Sargon was a humble cupbearer to King Orzababa of Kish. As a cupbearer, Sargon would have been a trusted servant, attending to the king's needs, but he was far from being a person of great political power. However, it was precisely this position of trust that allowed Sargon to observe the inner workings of the royal court and gain valuable insight into the political and military strategies of the time. It was during this period that Sargon began to harbor grand ambitions. He eventually turned on his master, King Orzababa, and led a rebellion against him. Some accounts suggest that Sargon, supported by a group of discontented soldiers and citizens, overthrew Orzababa and seized control of Kish. In doing so, Sargon transformed from a lowly servant into a powerful ruler, setting the stage for his expansion of power across Mesopotamia. Sargon's rise was not merely the result of military might. His ability to build alliances, both with powerful individuals within his own kingdom and with neighboring city-states, played a critical role in his ascent. In fact, many of his early successes as a ruler were a direct result of his ability to rally others to his cause. He was a master at forming political and military alliances, often by securing marriages and agreements with other city-states. This diplomatic approach, in combination with his military prowess, allowed Sargon to build a formidable network of supporters that would be instrumental in his conquest of Sumer. Once he had established his dominance over Kish, Sargon set his sights on the Sumerian city-states. Uruk, Lagash, and Ur were among the most powerful and influential cities in the region, but Sargon was undeterred by their strength. Using a combination of military campaigns and strategic alliances, Sargon quickly conquered these cities, consolidating his control over Sumer. His victories were swift and decisive, and with each conquest, his reputation as a skilled military leader grew. What made Sargon's rise unique was his ability to govern not just through military force, but also through administration. Once he had conquered a city-state, he didn't simply sack it and move on. He established a system of governance that allowed him to maintain control over the newly acquired territory. He appointed loyal governors, often from his own ranks or from trusted allies, to oversee these regions and ensure that they remained loyal to Akkad. This administrative approach helped stabilize the empire and ensured the smooth operation of his centralized government. Sargon also understood the importance of religion in legitimizing his rule. He saw himself not just as a political leader, but as a divinely chosen monarch. To cement his divine right to rule, Sargon sought the favor of the gods, particularly Marduk, the chief god of Babel. He established Marduk's worship as central to his empire, ensuring that the religious institutions under his control recognized his authority as the representative of the gods on earth. This divine endorsement was crucial for maintaining the loyalty of his subjects, as it reinforced the belief that Sargon's reign was not only politically legitimate, but also spiritually ordained. Another key factor in Sargon's ascension was his ability to adapt to the evolving political landscape of Mesopotamia. As he expanded his empire, Sargon recognized the importance of communication and the need for a unified administrative structure. He developed a system of written communication using cuneiform, which was the earliest known writing system. Cuneiform allowed Sargon to communicate across his vast empire, sending messages to governors, military leaders, and other officials. It also enabled him to keep detailed records of his conquests, alliances, and administration, providing a historical record of his reign that would last for centuries. Sargon's ability to blend military conquest with political and administrative savvy set him apart from other rulers of his time. While many monarchs before him relied on force alone to maintain power, Sargon understood that lasting empire building required careful planning, diplomacy, and the establishment of strong, reliable systems of governance. However, it is important to note that Sargon's rise to power was not without its challenges. His reign was marked by constant threats from rival city-states and internal unrest. The Akkadian Empire, despite its early successes, was a vast and complex entity, and maintaining control over such a large territory was a daunting task. Sargon's methods of governance were tested repeatedly, and the stability of his empire would be continually challenged by external forces and internal factions. But through it all, Sargon remained a determined and capable ruler, focused on securing his position and expanding his empire. Chapter 10. Administration and Bureaucracy. As Sargon the Great expanded his empire across Mesopotamia, the need for a sophisticated system of governance became clear. The Akkadian Empire was vast, encompassing a wide range of cultures, languages, and cities, all of which required careful management. Sargon's brilliance as a ruler extended beyond his military conquests. He recognized that to maintain control over his diverse empire, a centralized administrative structure was essential. This system of governance, known as bureaucracy, became one of the hallmarks of Sargon's reign and a defining feature of future empires in the region. Sargon's administrative innovations laid the foundation for future imperial governance. Before his rise to power, city-states in Mesopotamia were largely governed by local rulers or kings who had considerable autonomy. However, Sargon's empire required a more unified approach to ensure that all regions, from Akkad in the north to Sumer in the south, operated under a consistent system of law and order. To accomplish this, Sargon appointed governors, often known as ensi, to oversee different regions of the empire. These governors were responsible for ensuring that the king's policies were implemented, collecting taxes, maintaining law and order, and overseeing military defense. The governor's power, however, was not absolute. Sargon established a system of checks and balances where regional governors were overseen by central officials who reported directly to the king. This helped prevent local leaders from becoming too powerful and ensured loyalty to the Akkadian crown. The role of the governor was not limited to political matters. Many of them were also responsible for overseeing the religious practices of the cities under their control. Since religion played such a central role in legitimizing Sargon's reign, the governors were expected to maintain the king's connection to the gods in their territories. This included overseeing temple rituals, collecting religious offerings, and ensuring that the gods were properly worshipped. In addition to the governors, Sargon also employed a class of scribes and administrators who were responsible for keeping detailed records of all activities within the empire. These scribes used cuneiform, the early writing system developed by the Sumerians, to document transactions, tax payments, trade agreements, and royal decrees. The creation of written records allowed Sargon to maintain control over his empire and ensured that important information could be communicated quickly and accurately across vast distances. These records were also crucial for future generations, as they provided a historical record of the empire's activities and Sargon's reign. The centralized nature of Sargon's administration allowed for greater coordination of resources and military efforts. The empire was able to respond quickly to threats, whether from internal rebellions or external enemies. In times of war, Sargon's administrators coordinated the movement of troops, supplies, and resources across the empire, ensuring that the military was always well-equipped and prepared. This level of organization was crucial for the expansion and maintenance of the Akkadian Empire, which relied heavily on the ability to quickly mobilize resources and people. Sargon's bureaucracy also helped to facilitate trade and commerce throughout the empire. By implementing a standardized system of weights and measures, Sargon ensured that trade could flow smoothly between regions. Merchants and traders, both within the empire and beyond, relied on this system to conduct business with confidence, knowing that goods were being exchanged fairly and according to established standards. This not only encouraged economic growth, but also helped to unify the diverse regions of the empire, as trade routes connected previously isolated areas. One of the most important aspects of Sargon's bureaucracy was the development of legal codes. The king himself was considered the ultimate judge, responsible for ensuring that justice was maintained throughout the empire. However, Sargon's system of administration allowed for the delegation of legal matters to local officials, who were responsible for handling disputes and enforcing the law. This system of governance helped to maintain order and stability in the empire, as it provided a framework for resolving conflicts and ensuring that the king's laws were upheld. While Sargon's administrative system was highly effective, it was not without its challenges. The Akkadian Empire was vast, and managing such a large territory required constant communication and coordination. Governors and administrators often had to rely on messengers and couriers to convey messages, and the physical distance between regions made it difficult to maintain consistent control. Sargon's ability to establish a network of loyal officials and administrators helped mitigate these challenges. But the sheer size of the empire made governance a continual effort. Despite these challenges, the bureaucracy that Sargon established was a key factor in the success of the Akkadian Empire. It allowed for the efficient management of resources, the coordination of military efforts, and the facilitation of trade. It also ensured that Sargon's laws and policies were implemented across the empire, helping to maintain unity and stability. The legacy of Sargon's bureaucratic system can be seen in later empires, such as the Babylonian and Assyrian empires, which adopted similar systems of administration. Sargon's innovative approach to governance and administration helped to establish the Akkadian Empire as one of the most powerful and enduring empires in the ancient world. His ability to manage a vast and diverse territory with a centralized system of administration set a precedent for future rulers, and his legacy continues to influence the governance of empires to this day. Chapter 11. Military Power and Expansion of Akkadian Empires. Military strength was one of the key factors behind its rapid expansion and long-lasting influence in ancient Mesopotamia. Under Sargon the Great, the Akkadian army became a formidable force, capable of conquering vast territories and defending the empire from external threats. Sargon's military prowess not only shaped the future of Mesopotamia, but also set the standard for military organization and tactics for centuries to come. Sargon's approach to military power was one of innovation and organization. The Akkadian army was highly disciplined and well-equipped, with soldiers trained in a variety of combat techniques. The military was made up of a combination of infantry, archers, and chariotry, which allowed for flexibility and speed in battle. The use of chariots in particular gave the Akkadian army a significant advantage, as it allowed them to cover large distances quickly and outmaneuver enemies. These chariots, drawn by teams of horses, were used for both combat and transport, and their mobility made them a key component of Akkadian military strategy. One of the most important aspects of Sargon's military strategy was his ability to maintain a standing army. Unlike earlier civilizations, where armies were often only mobilized during times of war, the Akkadian Empire maintained a professional, permanent military force. This standing army allowed Sargon to respond rapidly to threats, whether from within his empire or from external enemies. It also enabled him to conduct multiple military campaigns simultaneously, securing his rule over vast territories. Sargon's military conquests began with the unification of Sumer. He first defeated the city-state of Kish, which was one of the most powerful rivals of the time, and then went on to conquer the other Sumerian cities, including Uruk, Lagash, and Ur. Sargon's forces employed a combination of siege tactics, surprise attacks, and outright battles to defeat these city-states. In many cases, Sargon's forces would surround and cut off their enemies, starving them into submission. The use of siege tactics, such as battering rams and scaling ladders, was a critical element of Sargon's military success. After consolidating his power in Sumer, Sargon expanded his empire into regions beyond Mesopotamia. He launched military campaigns to the west, conquering parts of Syria and Anatolia, and to the east, moving into the region of Elam, modern-day southwestern Iran. These expansions allowed the Akkadian Empire to secure vital trade routes and resources, further strengthening its position in the ancient world. One of the reasons for Sargon's success in these campaigns was his ability to adapt his tactics to the specific challenges of each region he conquered. In the mountainous regions of Elam, for example, Sargon's forces used guerrilla tactics to ambush and defeat the local armies, exploiting the terrain to their advantage. In contrast, in the flat plains of Syria, Sargon relied more heavily on his cavalry and chariots to strike quickly and decisively. Sargon's military campaigns were not just about conquest, they were also about maintaining control over the territories he had conquered. Once a city or region was brought under Akkadian rule, Sargon ensured its stability by appointing loyal governors and military commanders to oversee the area. These officials were responsible for maintaining law and order, collecting taxes, and organizing local defenses. Sargon's emphasis on central authority and military oversight helped prevent uprisings and ensured the loyalty of the empire's far-flung territories. The Akkadian military was also known for its use of psychological warfare. Sargon's army was often accompanied by large groups of musicians and drummers, who created an intimidating atmosphere on the battlefield. The sound of war drums and the sight of large, organized forces moving in formation helped demoralize enemies and struck fear into the hearts of those who might consider resisting Akkadian rule. Additionally, Sargon was known for his brutal treatment of defeated foes. He would often capture prisoners and use them as bargaining chips, and in some cases, he would have rebellious city-states destroyed completely as a warning to others. Sargon's military campaigns and conquests were not just limited to warfare. They also had significant cultural and economic implications. The expansion of the Akkadian Empire allowed for the spread of Akkadian culture, language, and religion. As Sargon conquered new territories, he promoted the use of the Akkadian language, which became the lingua franca of Mesopotamia. He also encouraged the worship of Akkadian gods, integrating the religious practices of conquered peoples into the Akkadian pantheon. This helped to create a sense of unity across the empire, as diverse groups were united under a common culture and religious framework. The military success of the Akkadian Empire under Sargon also helped to establish long-lasting trade routes. By securing vital territories such as Anatolia, Syria, and Elam, Sargon opened up new avenues for the exchange of goods, ideas, and technologies. The Akkadian Empire became a hub for trade, facilitating the movement of goods like timber, metals, and textiles across the ancient world. These trade routes played a crucial role in the economic prosperity of the empire and helped to establish Akkad as a major player on the world stage. However, as with all empires, maintaining military dominance was a continuous challenge. After Sargon's death, the Akkadian Empire faced internal struggles, external invasions, and rebellion from within its own territories. The empire's vast size made it difficult to govern, and the resources required to maintain a powerful military force were taxing. Despite these challenges, Sargon's military legacy lived on, influencing future empires in the region, including the Babylonian and Assyrian empires, which adopted many of the tactics and strategies that Sargon had used to expand and maintain his empire. Chapter 12. Social structure. Under the kings, the social structure of the Akkadian Empire was shaped by the king's authority and his ability to maintain order across a vast and diverse empire. At the top of this structure was the king himself, who was not only a political leader, but also a religious figure, acting as the intermediary between the gods and the people. Below the king, the social hierarchy was marked by a division of labor that ensured the empire's functioning, with each class playing a vital role in maintaining stability and prosperity. The highest class in Akkadian society was the nobility, composed of royal family members, high-ranking military officials, and influential priests. These individuals had direct access to the king and wielded considerable power within the empire. The nobility controlled large estates, which were often given to them as rewards for their loyalty and military service. They were the landowners, the generals, and the heads of the temple complexes, which were central to both religious and political life in the empire. The nobility also played a crucial role in administering the empire, with many serving as governors or high-ranking officials in the centralized bureaucracy established by Sargon. Below the nobility was the class of priests and scribes, who held great importance in Akkadian society. Priests were responsible for maintaining religious practices, ensuring that the gods were properly honored, and managing the temples. They also had significant influence in the political realm, as they were seen as divine intermediaries and advisors to the king. Scribes, trained in the art of writing, were the administrative backbone of the empire. They recorded laws, trade transactions, military campaigns, and royal decrees, making them essential for maintaining order and communication across the empire. Scribes were highly respected and held privileged positions in Akkadian society, often employed by the government or temples. The next class in the social hierarchy was the free citizens, who made up the majority of the population. These individuals were primarily engaged in agriculture, trade, and craftsmanship. Farmers worked the land, providing the empire with the food needed to sustain its population, while artisans and merchants produced goods for both local use and trade. This class was diverse and varied, with individuals living in urban centers or rural villages, depending on their occupation. Merchants played an important role in the economy, facilitating trade both within the empire and with neighboring regions. Many of these free citizens lived in relatively stable conditions, as the centralized bureaucracy ensured that taxes were collected and resources were distributed. Below the free citizens were the slaves and laborers, who occupied the lowest rung of Akkadian society. Slavery was a common practice in ancient Mesopotamia, and slaves were often captured during military campaigns or acquired through trade. Slaves performed a wide range of tasks, from agricultural work to domestic service, and were often employed by the nobility or temples. Some slaves were skilled craftsmen, while others worked as household servants or laborers in public works projects. Despite their low status, slaves could sometimes improve their position through loyalty or skill, and in some cases, they could be granted their freedom. Laborers, while not slaves, occupied a similarly low position in the social hierarchy. They were often employed in large-scale construction projects, such as the building of temples, ziggurats, and city walls. These workers were essential for the maintenance and expansion of the empire's infrastructure, but they were often subject to harsh working conditions. Many laborers lived in the cities, where they worked on public works or served the needs of the wealthier classes. The social structure in the Akkadian Empire was not fixed or rigid, and there was some mobility within it. While the nobility and religious elites held the highest positions, individuals could rise or fall in status based on their wealth, skill, or favor with the king. For example, skilled craftsmen could accumulate wealth and gain prestige through their work, while military leaders could rise through the ranks based on their success in battle. The king, as the ultimate authority, had the power to elevate individuals to higher positions within the social hierarchy, rewarding loyalty or talent with land, titles, or positions of power. Despite this potential for social mobility, the Akkadian Empire was marked by a clear division between the ruling elite and the majority of the population. The nobility and priests lived in luxury, enjoying access to the best food, goods, and services, while the majority of the population worked hard to support the empire. This class-based system was justified by the belief that the king's divine mandate required a stable and ordered society, where each person had a specific role to play. The king, as the representative of the gods, was seen as the ultimate guarantor of this social order, and it was his responsibility to ensure that each class was treated appropriately according to its role. The Akkadian Empire's social structure reflected the empire's broader political and religious system. The close ties between religion and governance reinforced the hierarchical nature of society. The king, as both a political and religious figure, maintained power through a system of patronage and loyalty, rewarding his supporters with land, titles, and positions of authority. In turn, the nobility, priests, and scribes ensured that the king's laws and policies were implemented and upheld. Though the social hierarchy in the Akkadian Empire was structured, it was not entirely static. The king's power allowed for some flexibility within the system, as individuals could rise or fall in status based on their contributions to the empire. This dynamic aspect of Akkadian society helped to maintain stability while also allowing for some degree of social mobility, even for those at the lower levels of the social order. Chapter 13. Everyday life. In early Mesopotamia. Everyday life. In early Mesopotamia, particularly under the Akkadian Empire, was shaped by the region's social hierarchy, religious beliefs, and the demands of maintaining a vast and complex empire. From the bustling urban centers to the rural farming villages, the lives of Mesopotamians were deeply intertwined with the rhythms of the land, the power of the gods, and the governance of the kings. Urban life in the cities of the Akkadian Empire, such as Akkad, Uruk, and Ur. Life was often a blend of bustling commerce, religious devotion, and political activity. These cities were centers of culture, administration, and trade, with towering ziggurats and impressive palaces dominating the skyline. Markets were central to daily life, with merchants and traders offering goods ranging from food and textiles to pottery, jewelry, and metals. People of all classes frequented these markets, with the wealthy purchasing luxury items and the poor relying on staple goods like barley, wheat, and dates. While the urban centers were centers of trade and wealth, They were also places of intense social stratification. The elite lived in luxurious homes, often with courtyards, gardens, and elaborate furnishings. They had access to the finest goods, including textiles imported from distant lands, fine pottery, and metalworks. The nobility and priests enjoyed a high standard of living, with food, servants, and entertainment in abundance. However, this wealth was not shared by the majority of the population. For the majority of the urban population, life was marked by hard work, limited resources, and a constant struggle to maintain basic living standards. The common people, including artisans, laborers, and merchants, lived in smaller, simpler homes, often made of mud brick. These homes were crowded and lacked many of the comforts enjoyed by the elites. However, even in these humble dwellings, the religious and cultural life of the city permeated daily activities. Many homes had small altars or shrines dedicated to the gods, and daily life was punctuated by prayers, offerings, and rituals to maintain the favor of the deities. The temples were central to urban life, not only as religious centers, but also as economic and administrative hubs. People from all walks of life would visit the temples regularly to make offerings, seek guidance, or participate in communal rituals. Priests and scribes would oversee these activities, recording the offerings and ensuring that religious duties were carried out according to the king's laws. The temple was not just a place of worship, but a place of power, where political decisions could be made and wealth could be distributed. Rural life. While urban life was characterized by commerce and political power, rural life was primarily concerned with agriculture. Most Mesopotamians lived in villages and towns outside the major cities, and their lives were dictated by the cycles of planting and harvesting. Farmers worked the land, cultivating crops such as barley, wheat, and dates, and raising livestock, including cattle, sheep, and goats. Irrigation was a key part of farming in Mesopotamia, as it allowed the Sumerians and Akkadians to control the flow of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers and water their fields year-round. Majority of rural laborers lived modestly, with many families working the land as tenant farmers. They were often bound to the land they worked, paying a portion of their crops to the temple or to a landowner in exchange for the right to farm. Some farmers were also required to perform public works or military service, depending on the demands of the king or the local governor. This labor system ensured that the empire's infrastructure was maintained, while also providing the resources needed to feed its large urban population. Life for rural farmers was physically demanding, with long hours spent working in the field. The tools they used were simple but effective, with plows drawn by oxen and sickles used to harvest grain. While farming was the backbone of the Akkadian economy, the hard labor involved meant that many farmers lived in poverty. The threat of natural disasters such as floods or droughts could also have devastating effects on their crops, leading to food shortages and hardship. Despite these challenges, the agricultural life of rural Mesopotamians was deeply connected to the land and the cycles of nature. Family and social life in Mesopotamian society. The family was the fundamental unit of social structure. The family was typically patriarchal, with the father holding authority over the household. Men were generally the breadwinners, working as farmers, craftsmen, or merchants, while women were responsible for managing the home and raising children. However, women in Mesopotamia were not entirely confined to the home. Some women worked outside the household as priestesses, merchants, or artisans. In fact, some women in the Akkadian Empire held positions of power, serving as priestesses or even as queens, and were able to influence the political and religious life of the empire. Marriage was an important institution, and it was often arranged by families to solidify alliances and secure resources. Women were typically married at a young age, and marriage was seen as a social duty. Children were valued members of the family, and it was expected that they would contribute to the household as they grew older. Education, however, was not widely available to all, and the majority of children learned skills through hands-on experience in the home or workshop, rather than in formal schools. Religious festivals and rituals played an important role in social life, bringing families and communities together. These events were often marked by feasting, music, dancing, and sacrifices to the gods. The religious calendar was filled with occasions for the people to celebrate the divine and to seek the favor of the gods, especially in times of drought, famine, or war. The temples were the focal points of these festivals, with the king, priests, and the people participating in grand ceremonies to honor the gods. Art and culture were highly valued in Mesopotamian society, and they played a significant role in daily life. Sumerians and Akkadians created a wide range of art forms, including sculpture, pottery, jewelry, and textiles. Temples, palaces, and royal tombs were often adorned with elaborate artwork, depicting gods, kings, and scenes of daily life. The craftsmanship in these works was highly refined, with metalworkers, sculptors, and weavers creating intricate designs that reflected both religious and political themes. Music, poetry, and storytelling were also central to Mesopotamian culture. The Epic of Gilgamesh, for example, was a key part of the cultural heritage, and its stories of heroism, friendship, and the search for immortality were passed down through generations. Music was an integral part of religious ceremonies, with instruments such as lyres, harps, and drums being played during temple rituals and festivals. These cultural expressions helped to unify the people, reinforcing shared values and beliefs. Chapter 14. Art and Culture. Under the first monarchs, art and culture flourished under the rule of the first monarchs of Mesopotamia, particularly during the Akkadian Empire. Sargon the Great and his successors not only built a powerful empire, but also established a cultural legacy that would influence the region for centuries. Art, religion, and literature were deeply intertwined, with rulers using cultural achievements to reinforce their power, honor the gods, and communicate their greatness to future generations. Monumental architecture. One of the most significant contributions of the first monarchs, especially during Sargon's reign, was the development of monumental architecture. The Akkadian kings built grand structures, including temples, palaces, and ziggurats, that symbolized their power and divine favor. These structures were not only centers of worship, but also expressions of royal authority. The ziggurats, massive stepped pyramids dedicated to the gods, were the most visible symbols of Sumerian and Akkadian architecture, and they towered over the cities, reminding the people of their king's connection to the divine. Sargon, in particular, expanded the construction of temples and palaces to reflect the grandeur of his empire. His capital city, Akkad, became the center of political and religious power, featuring large-scale public buildings adorned with intricate carvings and statues. The king's image was often prominently displayed in these buildings, reinforcing his status as a divinely ordained ruler. By commissioning such grand structures, Sargon and his successors not only beautified their cities, but also reinforced the idea that their rule was sanctioned by the gods. Sculpture and relief, art in addition to architecture. Sculpture was a key art form under the first monarchs. Statues of gods, kings, and important figures were created from materials such as stone, clay, and metal. These statues often served religious and political purposes, with the image of the king or a deity displayed in public spaces to remind the people of their ruler's divine right to govern. One of the most famous examples of Akkadian sculpture is the Stele of the Vultures, an intricate stone relief that commemorates the military victory of King Anatum of Lagash. Though this predates Sargon, it exemplifies the type of art used to celebrate royal achievements. Under Sargon's successors, monumental reliefs depicting the king's victories, divine favor, and accomplishments became common. These reliefs often showed the king in the act of receiving divine blessings or defeating enemies, emphasizing the king's role as the protector of his people and the representative of the gods on earth. The Akkadian period also saw the development of a distinctive style of sculpture. Unlike earlier periods, which favored highly stylized and abstract forms, Akkadian art began to embrace more realistic and detailed depictions of people and animals. Kings, warriors, and gods were often shown with more naturalistic features, highlighting the growing importance of individual identity and the king's personal connection to the divine. This shift in artistic style was a reflection of the changing political landscape, where rulers sought to present themselves as powerful, charismatic figures worthy of their elevated status. Cuneiform in literature. While monumental art and sculpture were vital to the Akkadian monarchs, literature also played a crucial role in shaping Mesopotamian culture. The invention of cuneiform writing, which had begun in the Sumerian period, was further developed and expanded during the Akkadian Empire. Cuneiform was initially created for administrative purposes, such as recording trade transactions and royal decrees. However, it quickly evolved into a vehicle for literary expression, enabling the recording of epic tales, historical records, and religious texts. One of the most famous literary works from this period is the Epic of Gilgamesh, which, although predating Sargon, was preserved and transmitted throughout Akkadian and later Mesopotamian civilizations. The epic, which tells the story of the Sumerian king Gilgamesh's journey to find immortality, became a foundational text in Mesopotamian culture. The story touched on themes of friendship, mortality, and the search for meaning in life, resonating with both rulers and commoners alike. The Epic of Gilgamesh became a key part of Mesopotamian religious and cultural identity, and its influence would extend beyond the region, inspiring works in later civilizations. Under the Akkadian kings, cuneiform writing was used to record royal achievements, religious texts, and legal codes. Sargon himself was responsible for commissioning numerous inscriptions that recorded his military conquests, his divine favor, and his establishment of the Akkadian Empire. These inscriptions were often carved into stone tablets and placed in temples or public buildings, where they would be seen by the people and serve as a permanent record of the king's greatness. Through these inscriptions, the kings were able to control their legacy, ensuring that their actions would be remembered for generations to come. The rise of cuneiform also led to the development of a class of scribes who were highly respected in Akkadian society. These scribes were responsible for writing and maintaining the empire's records, and their skills were essential for the administration of the empire. The education of scribes, often conducted in temple schools, became an important part of Mesopotamian culture. The scribes were not just record keepers, they were also the creators of literature, producing epic poems, hymns, and myths that reflected the values and beliefs of the time. Music and performance music also played a significant role in Mesopotamian culture, particularly in religious and royal contexts. Instruments such as the lyre, harp, and drums were used in temple ceremonies, royal banquets, and public celebrations. Music was believed to have a divine quality, capable of connecting the people with the gods. In fact, some temples had large ensembles of musicians who performed for the king and other high-ranking officials during religious festivals and state events. Royal performances were an important part of kings' public image, and music often accompanied these events. The presence of musicians at royal feasts, public ceremonies, and military victories added an aura of grandeur to these occasions. Music was not only a form of entertainment but also a means of reinforcing the divine nature of the king's rule, as it was closely tied to religious rituals and the worship of the gods. Cultural legacy, artistic and cultural achievements of the Akkadian Empire left a lasting legacy on Mesopotamian civilization. Sargon and his successors set a precedent for later kings, who would continue to use art, literature, and architecture to reinforce their power and connect with the divine. The Akkadian Empire's contributions to sculpture, literature, and music were not only expressions of royal power, but also reflections of the values and beliefs of the Mesopotamian people. In the centuries that followed the fall of the Akkadian Empire, the artistic styles and literary traditions developed during this period would continue to influence the civilizations that rose in Mesopotamia, including the Babylonians and Assyrians. The Akkadian kings, particularly Sargon, used art and culture as tools to strengthen their rule, ensuring that their legacy would endure long after their empires had crumbled. Chapter 15. The role of women in early Mesopotamian society. Role of women in early Mesopotamian society, particularly during the Akkadian Empire, was multifaceted, complex, and varied, depending on social class, region, and personal circumstances. While Mesopotamian society was predominantly patriarchal, with men holding positions of power in politics, religion, and military leadership, women were far from powerless. They played crucial roles in both the public and private spheres, and their contributions were vital to the functioning of the family, the economy, and even the state. Women in the family and household. At the most fundamental level, women were central to the structure of the family in Mesopotamian society. The family unit was the foundation of Mesopotamian social organization, and women were primarily responsible for managing the household. They oversaw domestic tasks such as cooking, cleaning, weaving, and child-rearing. In a society where agriculture and food production were critical, women also participated in farming and the processing of food, particularly grain and textiles. They often worked alongside men in the fields, though their roles were generally more focused on the management of the household and ensuring that the family's needs were met. Marriage was a key social institution, and women were typically married at a young age, often arranged by their families. In a patriarchal society, women were expected to bear children and raise them according to the norms and values of the family and society. Fertility and motherhood were highly valued, and many women were celebrated for their ability to bear children, particularly male heirs. Women's roles in reproduction were often seen as part of their divine responsibility, with fertility linked to the favor of the gods. Women in religion in Mesopotamian society. Religion was a powerful force that permeated every aspect of life. Women played an important role in religious practices, both as devotees of the gods and as leaders in religious ceremonies. One of the most prominent roles for women in Mesopotamian religion was as priestesses. The temples, which were central to the social, economic, and political life of Mesopotamian cities, employed women in a variety of religious capacities. Some women served as high priestesses, managing the temple's affairs, overseeing rituals, and offering sacrifices to the gods. These women held significant influence and were often regarded as the intermediaries between the divine and the mortal world. The most famous example of a powerful priestess is the figure of Enheduanna, the high priestess of the moon god Nana in the city of Ur. Enheduanna was not only a religious leader, but also a poet and writer, producing some of the earliest known works of literature. Her status as both a religious figure and a poet shows the potential for women to rise to positions of intellectual and cultural prominence in early Mesopotamian society. Though priestesses held significant religious power, they were still subject to the constraints of a male-dominated society. Most religious roles for women were centered around domestic worship and the maintenance of household altars. These practices, while important, were less visible than the public rituals performed by male priests, and women's religious power was generally confined to the private sphere. Women in politics and governance. Although Mesopotamian society was predominantly patriarchal, there were a few notable women who held positions of political power and influence. These women, often queens or royal consorts, played important roles in the governance of their city-states or empires, though their power was often indirect and limited by the patriarchal structure. One of the most notable women in early Mesopotamian politics was Queen Shub-ad, also known as Pu-abai, the queen of the Sumerian city-state of Ur. Her tomb, discovered in the royal cemetery at Ur, is one of the most significant archaeological finds from the period, providing valuable insights into the role of women in the royal court. Shub-ad's tomb contained elaborate grave goods, including jewelry and ceremonial objects, which suggest that she was a woman of considerable wealth and status. While the exact nature of her political power is unclear, her burial and the lavish items associated with her suggest that she held an important position in the royal court. In the Akkadian Empire, women were sometimes involved in political decision-making, though their influence was largely indirect. Some queens served as regents, particularly when their husbands were absent or during periods of political instability. These women would have had to exercise significant political acumen to maintain their power and manage the affairs of the empire. However, even in these rare cases, women's authority was often subordinate to the king, and their political power was generally exercised through their roles as mothers, wives, or daughters of the king. Women in the economy. While men dominated the public sphere, women were essential to the functioning of the economy. In addition to their roles in agriculture and the household, women in Mesopotamian society were involved in trade, textile production, and craft work. Many women worked as weavers, spinning wool and flax into cloth, which was a valuable commodity in the ancient world. The production of textiles was a highly skilled craft, and women often worked together in communal workshops, where they could exchange techniques and products. Women also played an important role in the marketplace. They were involved in the buying and selling of goods, particularly foodstuffs, textiles, and household items. Some women may have even been involved in long-distance trade, as the Akkadian Empire's vast territory opened up new commercial opportunities. Women's involvement in trade, both at the local and regional levels, contributed to the economic prosperity of the empire. Legal rights and social mobility in early Mesopotamian society. Women's legal rights were more limited than those of men, but they were not entirely powerless. Women could own property, engage in trade, and enter into contracts, though their legal rights were often mediated by their relationship to a male relative, such as a father, husband, or brother. The Code of Ur-Nammu, one of the earliest known legal codes, provided some protections for women, including laws concerning marriage, divorce, and inheritance. However, these rights were often contingent upon the woman's social status and her relationship to the male head of the household. Women could also seek divorce in cases of mistreatment or neglect, though the legal process was still heavily weighted in favor of men. Inheritance laws generally favored male heirs, though women could inherit property if they had no male relatives. While women had some legal rights, they were still confined to the roles that society expected of them, and their legal status was often subordinate to that of men. Despite these constraints, women in early Mesopotamian society could exercise a degree of social mobility, particularly if they were wealthy or of noble birth. Women could rise to positions of power in religion, politics, and the economy, though these opportunities were limited and usually reserved for those with familial connections to powerful men. Conclusion: the role of women in early Mesopotamian society was complex and multifaceted. While their social and political influence was often constrained by a patriarchal system, women still played crucial roles in the family, religion, politics, and the economy. The contributions of women in the Akkadian Empire and earlier Sumerian society were vital to the functioning of the empire, and their roles in religious leadership, trade, and cultural production were essential to the development of Mesopotamian civilization. Despite the challenges they faced, women in early Mesopotamia were far from passive figures. They shaped the social, political, and economic landscape of their time, and their legacies continue to be remembered through the artifacts, texts, and monuments that have survived to this day. Chapter 16. The decline of the Akkadian Empire. The Akkadian Empire, which had once stood as a powerful beacon of centralization and military might, eventually succumbed to a combination of internal and external pressures that led to its decline. Despite the impressive achievements of Sargon the Great and his successors, the empire faced challenges that would prove insurmountable, marking the end of its dominance in Mesopotamia. This chapter explores the factors that contributed to the collapse of the Akkadian Empire, including internal instability, external invasions, economic difficulties, and environmental factors. Internal instability. The Akkadian Empire, like many empires, struggled with internal stability. Sargon's vision of a centralized empire was remarkable, but maintaining control over such a vast and diverse territory proved to be difficult. As the empire expanded, the balance of power between the central government and the regional governors began to shift. While Sargon and his immediate successors, such as Naram-Sin, were able to maintain centralized control, later rulers faced challenges from local leaders who sought more autonomy. As the empire grew, the communication and logistical challenges of governing its vast territory became more pronounced. The governors who had been appointed by Sargon began to assert their own authority, often prioritizing the interests of their local regions over those of the empire. This decentralization weakened the power of the central government and created divisions within the empire as different regions began to act more independently. The Akkadian monarchy also struggled with succession issues. While Sargon had established a strong legacy, his successors did not always live up to his leadership. The empire saw periods of weak rulers who were unable to effectively manage the growing tensions within the empire. Political instability within the royal family, combined with frequent changes in leadership, further eroded the empire's unity and ability to respond to external threats. External invasions. One of the most significant external factors contributing to the Akkadian Empire's decline was the invasion of the Gutians, a group of mountain-dwelling peoples from the east. The Gutians had long been a thorn in the side of the Akkadian Empire, and their invasions in the mid-22nd century before Common Era proved devastating. They infiltrated the empire, taking control of key cities and disrupting trade routes. The Gutians' invasions were characterized by their brutal tactics, and their presence in Mesopotamia contributed to the collapse of the central authority of the Akkadian kings. The invasion of the Gutians marked the beginning of a period of instability that saw the Akkadian Empire fractured into smaller, weaker states. The Gutians were able to capture the capital, Akkad, and the city fell into disrepair. Though the Akkadian Empire would eventually regain some semblance of unity, the damage done by the Gutians left lasting scars on the empire's infrastructure and political structure. Economic decline. The Akkadian Empire's vast economy, which had once flourished through trade, agriculture, and centralized administration, began to unravel in the years leading to its decline. The combination of internal instability, external invasions, and environmental factors placed enormous strain on the empire's economy. Agricultural production, the backbone of the empire's economy, suffered from a series of natural disasters. Droughts and irregular flooding of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers damaged crop yields, leading to food shortages. The inability to maintain steady agricultural production undermined the stability of the empire, as the population struggled to sustain itself. This situation worsened as the empire's political structure weakened and the central government became less effective at managing resources. Trade, which had been a key factor in the Akkadian Empire's success, was also disrupted by the invasions of the Gutians and the political instability that followed. With the fall of key cities and the decline of central authority, long-distance trade routes became unsafe, and the flow of goods from distant regions dried up. The Akkadian economy, which had once thrived through commerce with neighboring civilizations, was crippled by the loss of trade. Environmental factors, in addition to internal and external political and economic factors, environmental changes also played a significant role in the decline of the Akkadian Empire. Archaeological evidence suggests that the region may have experienced a prolonged period of drought during the time of the Akkadian collapse. The rivers that provided irrigation for agriculture became less reliable, and the lack of water may have contributed to crop failures, food shortages, and social unrest. The changing climate likely exacerbated the challenges faced by the Akkadian Empire. The failure of the irrigation systems and the inability to sustain large-scale agricultural production undermined the economic foundations of the empire. This environmental stress, combined with the empire's internal weaknesses and external threats, created a perfect storm that led to the empire's eventual collapse. The fall of Akkad. The final blow to the Akkadian Empire came with the collapse of its capital city, Akkad. After the invasion of the Gutians, Akkad was abandoned and fell into ruin. The loss of the capital city symbolized the disintegration of the empire itself. With no central authority to hold the empire together, the once unified territories fragmented into smaller, competing city-states, and the Akkadian Empire ceased to exist as a political entity. Although the Akkadian Empire fell, its cultural legacy continued to influence the region for centuries. The Akkadian language, which had become the lingua franca of Mesopotamia, remained in use for centuries after the collapse of the empire. The administrative systems, religious practices, and military strategies developed under the Akkadian kings influenced the later empires of Mesopotamia, including the Babylonian and Assyrian empires. The memory of the Akkadian Empire lived on, and its rise and fall became a model for future rulers. Chapter 17. The Legacy of the First Monarchs. The legacy of the first monarchs of Mesopotamia, particularly Sargon the Great and his successors, left an indelible mark on the course of history. While the Akkadian Empire eventually fell to internal instability, external invasions, and environmental challenges, its influence endured long after the collapse. The achievements of the early Mesopotamian monarchs provided a blueprint for future empires and shaped the political, cultural, and social landscape of the ancient world. Political and administrative innovation, son of the most enduring legacies of the first monarchs of Mesopotamia, was their system of governance. Sargon's establishment of a centralized bureaucratic state was a revolutionary development in the history of empires. Prior to Sargon, Mesopotamia was divided into independent city-states, each governed by its own ruler. Sargon's vision of a unified empire, governed by a central authority with appointed governors overseeing regional territories, set a precedent for future empires, both in Mesopotamia and beyond. The system of centralized administration, with appointed officials managing the various aspects of the empire's economy, military, and religion, would be adopted and refined by later civilizations. The use of written records, particularly cuneiform, to document laws, trade, and administrative decisions, was another key development that helped to ensure the smooth functioning of the Akkadian Empire. The bureaucratic practices established by the first monarchs laid the foundation for the complex administrative systems of later empires, including the Babylonian and Assyrian empires. In addition to the development of a centralized bureaucracy, The idea of divine kingship was another lasting legacy of the first monarchs. The notion that kings were chosen by the gods to rule on their behalf became a defining characteristic of Mesopotamian governance. This concept of divine rule influenced not only Mesopotamian rulers, but also the monarchs of Egypt, Persia, and other ancient civilizations, creating a common framework for royal authority that persisted for centuries. Military strategy and empire building. The military strategies and tactics developed under Sargon the Great and his successors also left a significant legacy. The Akkadian Empire was the first major empire in history, and its military successes demonstrated the power of a centralized, professional army. Sargon's ability to conquer and control such a vast territory was a testament to the strength and organization of his military forces. The use of chariots, infantry, and siege warfare to defeat enemies and expand the empire became a model for future military leaders. Sargon's military campaigns also set the stage for future imperial expansion. His conquests of Sumerian city-states and neighboring regions such as Syria, Anatolia, and Elam showed that large empires could be created through a combination of military force, strategic alliances, and efficient governance. The ability to unite diverse peoples under one ruler became a hallmark of imperial rule in the ancient world, and Sargon's success inspired future empires to adopt similar military and political strategies. The Akkadian Empire's military legacy was further cemented by the establishment of long-distance trade routes, which facilitated the movement of goods and resources across the empire and beyond. These trade routes were vital not only for economic prosperity, but also for the expansion of cultural influence. The idea of maintaining control over strategic trade routes and using military power to protect them became a key strategy for subsequent empires, including those of the Babylonians and Assyrians. Cultural and religious influence. The cultural and religious legacy of the Akkadian Empire was equally significant. Sargon and his successors promoted the spread of Akkadian language and culture, which became dominant in Mesopotamia and surrounding regions. The Akkadian language, written in cuneiform, replaced Sumerian as the language of administration, trade, and literature. Over time, Akkadian became the lingua franca of much of the ancient Near East, and its influence persisted long after the fall of the Akkadian Empire. The religious practices of the Akkadian Empire, which were centered around the worship of gods such as Marduk, Enlil, and Inanna, also left a lasting legacy. The idea of divine kingship, where the king was seen as the representative of the gods on earth, became a central tenet of Mesopotamian religion. This concept influenced not only later Mesopotamian rulers, but also the rulers of other ancient civilizations, who adopted the idea that their authority was divinely sanctioned. Sargon and his successors also played a key role in promoting the spread of religious and cultural ideas throughout the empire. The Akkadian kings were patrons of the arts and literature, commissioning works that celebrated their victories, divine favor, and the glory of their reigns. These works, including monumental inscriptions and epic poetry, helped to solidify the cultural identity of the empire and ensured that the legacy of the first monarchs would be remembered for generations. The enduring legacy in later civilizations. Despite the collapse of the Akkadian Empire, the political, military, and cultural achievements of its first monarchs had a profound impact on later civilization. The idea of centralized rule, the use of professional armies, and the concept of divine kingship became core elements of governance in the ancient world. The administrative and military systems established by the Akkadian monarchs were adopted and refined by the Babylonians, Assyrians, and Persians, who built their own empires upon the foundations laid by Sargon and his successors. The Akkadian Empire's influence can also be seen in the development of art, literature, and architecture in later civilizations. The Akkadian style of sculpture, which emphasized realism and detailed depictions of kings and gods, was carried forward by subsequent rulers who used art as a means of reinforcing their power and divine favor. The epic literature of Mesopotamia, including the Epic of Gilgamesh, continued to inspire writers and poets in later periods, and its themes of heroism, mortality, and the quest for meaning in life resonated across cultures. The cultural diffusion facilitated by the Akkadian Empire also helped to shape the development of neighboring civilizations. The spread of Akkadian language and cultural practices influenced the rise of the Babylonian and Assyrian empires, which built upon the political and administrative systems established by the Akkadians. Even after the fall of Akkad, the memory of its greatness persisted, and the achievements of its first monarchs continued to inspire rulers and empires, throughout the ancient world. Conclusion: the legacy of the first monarchs of Mesopotamia, particularly Sargon the Great, left an indelible mark on the course of history. From the development of centralized administration and divine kingship to the establishment of powerful military strategies and the spread of cultural and religious ideas, the Akkadian Empire's achievements shaped the political, military, and cultural landscape of the ancient Near East. Though the Akkadian Empire eventually fell, its legacy lived on, influencing the rise of later empires and the continued development of civilization in the region. Chapter 18. The influence of Mesopotamian kingship. Concept of kingship that emerged in Mesopotamia, particularly during the Akkadian Empire, left a profound and lasting influence on the history of governance in the ancient world and beyond. The idea of a king as both a political and divine figure was central to the development of many subsequent empires in the Near East and shaped the trajectory of royal power for centuries. The model of kingship that began with Sargon the Great and his successors became a foundation upon which later rulers built their own legacies, and it profoundly influenced how leaders were viewed by their people. The religious justification for their rule and their role in both the political and spiritual life of their societies. Divine kingship and its legacy. At the core of Mesopotamian kingship was the belief that kings were divinely chosen to rule on behalf of the gods. This idea was deeply rooted in the Akkadian Empire and became a central tenet of later Mesopotamian dynasties. Sargon the Great, for example, was seen not just as a political leader but as a representative of the gods on earth. His military successes, political acumen, and religious devotion were all framed within the idea that he had been chosen by the divine to unite the land and protect its people. This concept of divine kingship was not unique to the Akkadian Empire. It spread to other civilizations, influencing the rise of later empires, such as those of Babylon, Assyria, Persia, and beyond. The notion that kings were earthly agents of the gods became a foundational principle of ancient Near Eastern governance. It granted the king not only political power but also religious authority, positioning him as the mediator between the divine and human realms. In the centuries following the Akkadian Empire's collapse, this idea of divine kingship continued to shape the political culture of the region. Babylonian kings, such as Hammurabi, and Assyrian monarchs, such as Ashurbanipal, followed in Sargon's footsteps, claiming divine approval for their reigns. They too depicted themselves as chosen by the gods to bring justice, peace, and prosperity to their people, and they used religious rituals and monuments to reinforce their divine authority. Kingship as a symbol of unity and authority. Another critical aspect of Mesopotamian kingship was the king's role in maintaining unity and order within the empire. In the Akkadian period, the concept of a single ruler who could unify disparate regions and peoples under one banner was revolutionary. The early kings of Mesopotamia were not just political leaders. They were the embodiment of the state itself, and their authority was considered essential to the stability of the kingdom. The ability to unify diverse peoples was one of the most significant achievements of the Akkadian Empire. Under Sargon, the idea of a centralized empire became a reality, with the king as the supreme authority who commanded both loyalty and respect. The Akkadian king's image was carefully cultivated, often through monumental art, inscriptions, and royal decrees, to reinforce the idea that the king's power was absolute and unquestionable. The role of kingship in maintaining unity was evident in the way kings handled both internal and external threats. Kings like Sargon and Naram-Sin demonstrated that military conquests, along with administrative control and religious legitimacy, were necessary to keep the empire intact. The centralization of power under one ruler allowed for more effective governance, and it was the king's responsibility to ensure that all parts of the empire functioned together in harmony. Kingship and the protection of order. The notion of kingship as the protector of order and justice was another legacy of the Mesopotamian kings. The king was seen as a guarantor of peace, justice, and prosperity for his people. This view of kingship was articulated in the legal codes that emerged during this period, such as the famous Code of Ar-Namo and later the Code of Hammurabi. These codes, which were written down and made publicly available, established a framework for laws and punishments that were supposed to reflect the king's divine responsibility to maintain justice. By enforcing laws, ensuring the fair distribution of resources, and organizing the military for defense, the king was responsible for maintaining the peace and stability of the kingdom. In this way, kingship became synonymous with order, and the king's role as a ruler was deeply tied to his ability to ensure that the god's will was done in the world. This idea was echoed in royal propaganda, where kings would depict themselves as protectors of the weak, defenders of the land, and avengers of wrongdoers. Kingship and monumentality. Mesopotamian kings, especially during the Akkadian period, used monumental architecture and art to reinforce their authority and to make their presence known throughout the empire. The construction of temples, ziggurats, palaces, and statues was a way for the king to visually demonstrate his power and legitimacy. These structures were often dedicated to gods and portrayed the king as the favored servant of the divine. Sargon's use of monumental art was key to reinforcing his image as a powerful and divine ruler. His image was frequently depicted in sculptures and inscriptions, often showing him in the company of the gods or engaged in heroic deeds. These depictions were not just artistic representations. They were political statements meant to communicate the king's divine right to rule and his role as protector of the land. The monumental buildings constructed by the first monarchs, particularly the ziggurats, also symbolized the connection between the divine and the earthly realms. The ziggurats, which served as temples to the gods, were the tallest structures in Mesopotamian cities, representing the link between heaven and earth. The king's role as the intermediary between the gods and the people was central to these buildings, and his presence in these spaces was meant to underscore his divine mandate. The spread of the kingship model. The model of kingship developed in Mesopotamia, particularly under the Akkadian monarchs, influenced other cultures and civilizations. The idea of a divinely ordained ruler who unified diverse peoples and maintained order through both military and religious authority spread beyond Mesopotamia, especially during the rise of the Persian Empire. Persian kings, such as Cyrus the Great and Darius I, adopted many of the practices established by the Akkadian monarchs, including the use of royal inscriptions and the promotion of divine kingship. This model also had an impact on other parts of the ancient world, including Egypt, where pharaohs were seen as living gods, and in later empires like Rome, where emperors were often depicted as the divine representatives of the gods. The legacy of Mesopotamian kingship can be seen in the way that rulers across history have used religion, art, and monumental architecture to legitimize their power and authority. Conclusion: the influence of Mesopotamian kingship, particularly the model developed during the Akkadian Empire, was profound and far-reaching. The divine nature of kingship, the use of monumental art and architecture, and the role of the king as the protector of order and justice became essential components of royal governance in many ancient civilizations. The legacy of Sargon and his successors, along with the enduring concepts of centralized authority, divine rule, and military power, continued to shape the politics, culture, and art of later empires. Mesopotamian kingship set the stage for the future of empires, and its influence can still be seen in the ways rulers today use symbols of power and legitimacy to rule.